This week, we'll begin talking about the Early Woodland period, which for our purposes we'll say runs from approximately 1000 BC to AD 1000. And I wanted to ease you into the Early Woodland period by talking about early woodland cavers. It turns out that the peak exploration and use of midcontinental caves occurred during the Early Woodland period. And during this time, during the Early Woodland, cavers were exploring caves just for fun. They were leaving behind drawings. Sometimes they left behind bodies. They were mining chert. They were living in the vestibule. And especially, they went into caves to mine cave minerals. I want to talk in particular about the Mammoth Cave area in west central Kentucky. And the first book on archaeology and caving, I think, came out, Archaeology of the Mammoth Cave Area by my advisor, Patty Jo Watson. And it was followed later by a book she wrote on caving at Salts Cave, which is also within Mammoth Cave National Park. Here at Salts Cave, early woodlanders, were camping in the vestibule of the cave. And the vestibule is the entrance area where the sunlight enters. So nobody lived back in the cave where it was dark. They traveled back in there, but they lived up in the opening where they could see the sunlight. And it was from there that they made trips far back into the cave. And you can see here that there's some very complex stratigraphy that has built up through the years of people camping in the vestibule. Here's a shot of the vestibule today. And it's dark now because being in a national park, it has a gate closing it. So, but back when people were living here, sunlight would have been coming down that slope that people are walking down. And that pit that you saw was down there by those slabs that are sticking up out of the ground. Early woodland cavers explored and mined in the main trunks of the caves. And in Mammoth Cave, these could be quite large trunks, 50 feet high, 50 feet across. But they also explored tiny passageways, and they went deep underground. Cave explorers and miners used bundles of dried cane. And on the right here, I show a modern-day cane. It's our native bamboo. And they dried the sticks of that, and they simply bundled them together using a piece of bark, and they lit them. And through experimentation, we've found out that these cane torches can last for at least an hour, perhaps a bit longer. And something else we found is that as they moved through the cave, ash would build up on the end of the cane torches. And so they would just knock that ash off against the side of the cave wall, leaving these marks like this. And then down on the ground below, you would find the little bits of charcoal. And that is what we can date. Radiocarbon date to see when people were moving through the cave. So some experimental archaeology was done. Some volunteer cavers put on shorts and went barefoot. And they learned a couple of things. One, you keep your cane torch to the side of you so that you're not dropping hot coals immediately in front of you that you then step on. The cavers left behind not only old sandals like this, made of local plant fibers, and many of them were made of a plant called rattlesnake master that grows in the prairie patches at Mammoth Cave National Park. It's kind of an agave-looking plant on the bottom, and it looks like a thistle on top, a very puzzling plant. I grow it now in my garden. But they also left behind their footprints, both in dust on the top and in mud on the bottom. Very exciting to see somebody's footprint from several thousand years ago. And to see their sandals also and how they made them. They were leaving footprints like this, not just in Salts Cave, Kentucky, but elsewhere, such as in places like Jaguar Cave, Tennessee. And because I was a student of Patty Jo Watson, I worked both in Mammoth Cave, Salts Cave, and also I helped to map these footprints that you see on the left-hand side here in Jaguar Cave. And in Jaguar Cave, people were entering way up here through a creek, very pretty entrance. You walk through the creek, and then you climb up this very slippery thing, and you come out this way, and then and that's a good 600 some meters. Then you come out another 500 some meters out to about in here, and that's where you find these. And this is where people entered this very pretty room that has formations with flowstone columns, and they just milled around looking at it, and then they left. In Jaguar Cave, the footprints are over 5,000 years old, or late archaic, so they're some of the earliest deep cave explorations that we know of in North America. And I've put on here a link to a PDF that tells you what's happened to the footprints since we mapped them in the mid-1970s. Most exciting of all, from my point of view, is that Salt's Cave cavers left behind hundreds of feces. And here's a cross-section of one. Now, you might be asking yourself, how do we know that it's a human feces and not, say, a bear feces? It's pretty darn big. Well, it turns out that one of the things that people who analyze paleofecal material do is reconstitute a little bit of it in water. And human feces have a unique human feces smell. So the smell tells you. These have what's inside of them. Well, it's great because unlike the stuff I normally look at, which is the things that people didn't eat, but what they accidentally burnt, here we can tell exactly what they were eating. And you can even sometimes tell if it was a man or a woman because there's DNA. But they were eating the Eastern agricultural complex of chenopodium and maygrass, chenopod, maygrass, sumpweed, and wild foods such as nuts and strawberries. Now, on rain days when I worked, I did my master's thesis in Mammoth Cave looking at plant remains from the rock shelters. On rainy days, we would go in the cave and measure the length and diameter and count of feces. So I spent a lot of time with these feces, and they're everywhere. And many of them were quite large like this. And I wondered, how could they be so large? So I came up with a semi-joking but true estimation of what I call the fecal fluff factor. And that is that they had such an extremely high fiber diet, way more than we can imagine today, that as the feces dried out, they fluffed up. And they weren't really this big when they first came out, but I don't know that we'll ever know. So what were they mining in there? Well, two minerals that we know they were mining were gypsum, which you see a gypsum flower here on the left, and mirabilite. And gypsum is what you can grind to make a white powder, and mirabilite is eaten as a laxative. So they both look pretty similar, but mirabilite tastes a little bit salty. And again, cavers volunteered and did some experimental archaeology, and they tried eating mirabilite. And I think something like 1 or 2 tablespoons will do you, is what they discovered. The cavers left behind their gourd and hard-shelled squash that they were using as containers and bowls. They left behind shell scoops, like you see on the bottom left, net bags, baskets, like the one that Patty Jo is looking at, and wooden climbing poles, like you see on the right. And here's an artist's reconstruction of somebody climbing up a climbing pole to a ledge. He's using cane torch. He's got a few spare ones there, and he's chipping off into a gourd bowl some of the minerals. Think about it. Some of the cave minerals were pretty miraculous because once you took them outside, they melted into water. I mean, how kind of crazy is that to have what looks like a stone in the cave and you bring it outside and it turns to water? One of the early woodland miners died while he was mining. He accidentally dislodged a boulder and it fell on him and crushed him. So he had his net bag, he had his toolkit with him, and he was crushed to death under this boulder. And there you see some pieces of cane torch on his right. Also found in that, he was found in Mammoth Cave, and he used to be on display. That's not the done thing anymore. And I actually was with the party that carried him off and took him off display and put him further back in the cave. But also found in Salt's Cave was this young child who apparently died of internal injuries. Perhaps he was in the cave and he fell, and they left his body curled up, as you see him here, as if he were asleep on a ledge. And he kind of naturally mummified. They've found drawings in caves, including those marked with charcoal, incised into rock, or just with a finger or a stick carved into mud. And particularly famous is Mudcliff Cave in Tennessee. So, isn't it wonderful to find such well-preserved evidence of human behavior from such an early age? It's almost unimaginable. It's one of the most exciting things that I can say I've done in my life is to travel a mile back into the cave and seen human footprints from the early woodland period and measured their feces. Not something everybody would want to do, but I really enjoyed it. So for Wednesday, March 25th, read your text on Early Woodland, pages 112 through 121, and watch that PowerPoint that I'll post on Early Woodland.